Hi, Rudyard Griffiths here, the publisher of The Hub. Welcome to this, our continuing video series called Trump's Trade War. We're bringing you the best commentators and thinkers from The Hub, weighing in on the various aspects of this remarkable moment that the country finds itself in. We're in day 19. Time is going by, but the pace of events continues to accelerate. And to unpack a really interesting column that he wrote for us today is the University of Calgary's Trevor Tombe. Trevor, welcome to the program.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
I want to start, Trevor, with a quote from your article today. You wrote in the Hub that Pierre Poilievre's proposal for creating free trade in Canada is appealing, but it has drawbacks in your view. So give us a quick synopsis of what Pierre Poilievre's proposal is for trying to encourage more free trade between the provinces and why you think maybe it has room for improvement.
Sure. So first, in the face of rising uncertainty abroad, especially with trading relationships with the United States, I think it's more important now than ever to reduce barriers to doing business within our own country. And I think this is what Pierre Poilievre's plan recognizes, that improving internal trade can create economic benefits for the country that can, help offset some of the challenges of a more uncertain world. But unfortunately, the federal government has limited tools. Most of the problems here are because provinces maintain differences in their rules and regulations and standards and certifications. They don't recognize the credentials of professionals from other parts of Canada, for example. And the federal government can't force them to change what is in their area of jurisdiction. But what the federal government can do, and this is where I think Poilievre's idea is really interesting, is create incentives for provinces to act. And so what Poilievre put forward was a plan that included boosted federal transfers, what they called a free trade bonus, to provinces that take steps to eliminate some of these interprovincial barriers, and would tie that additional funding to the resulting productivity gains that we'd see nationally if we had freer internal trade. So I think, in principle, it's a really a good idea, offering carrots, if you will, to provinces. But the size of the carrots would need to be quite significant for provinces to respond and change behavior. And I think now we have federal finances strained, a deficit that rises with each successive year. And so this would be adding to federal spending that might make it more difficult to balance the budget over a reasonable time horizon. And then also connecting the boosted transfer, the free trade bonus, tying that to productivity gains would be difficult. I think beyond question there would be gains, but precisely how large the gains are from any
Right.
particular provincial action would be something subject to a great deal of disputes between provincial and federal governments. So what I put forward in the column instead is to say, well, we already transfer a considerable amount to provincial governments, and we could add conditions to those transfers. Canada Health transfer, tens of billions of dollars provided to provinces. We could basically say, well, you don't get that transfer at all unless you recognize all the health credentials from any other province as valid for your own. We could tie the social transfer to recognizing professional credentials across the board, or mutual recognition agreements that provinces would need to enact. So we could, instead of adding new transfers, simply withhold existing ones, and that would create the same kind of incentive that Poilievre's idea, was aimed at, but at no cost to the federal government.
Wow. I like the sound of that. A more kind of muscular federal government. I guess I want to ask you, Trevor, as an economist, why do you think free trade within Canada has proven so elusive when, the benefits, even before this tariff threat from America emerged, were obvious? I guess what I'm trying to understand is how entrenched are those provincial interests? Because I think it lends credence to your argument that maybe a more maximal approach is necessary, that it's not just carrots, it's a bit of stick at the same time, because let's face it, we had all kinds of reasons, didn't we, Trevor, to move on this, but we haven't done it now for decades, and there must be reasons why.
Yeah, the gains have always been there. I think that this moment of disruption potentially with the United States is just reminding us of, the luxury of incurring economic costs through policy choices, maybe one we can no longer afford or should no longer accept. Now, part of the challenge with internal free trade is similar to the challenge that we face when liberalizing international trade. There are interests that benefit from current arrangements. We've talked about, licensing and credentials recognition. There's about 600 provincial licensing bodies across the country, and they have power and authority to determine who can and cannot practice a particular profession in that province. And if one were to say, well, if you're a podiatrist from New Brunswick, then you're good to go in Manitoba automatically, no questions asked, then that would come at the cost of some of that independent authority of the local licensing body. And so it would require a provincial government push through and pass those entrenched interests that would resist liberalizing internal trade, in this case, in services. Other examples include things like inspections of vehicles. For example, if you have a brand new roadworthy car in British Columbia and you then move to another province, you need an inspection, even though obviously the car is just fine. That does represent some potential foregone revenue to dealerships or service centers, local Canadian Tires, and so on. So there are beneficiaries of barriers, and they tend to know who they are. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
the benefits of free trade, we see that as individuals in the form of slightly higher productivity, slightly higher income, slightly lower prices. But that's a set of benefits that's diffuse across the
Right.
population. And so while it adds up to a lot more than the costs of protectionism, the costs are more visible and concentrated. And so that creates a kind of political challenge internally, just as it does internationally.
Well, a different form of rent seeking. We've got a lot of that in
Exactly.
Canada. You in the column say that a maximal approach would be to take all the different transfers, wrap them up in something you've characterized as a kind of Canada benefit, and then use that as a mechanism to push this through for once and for all. Explain what that might look like if we really wanted to try to be assertive in this moment, see the federal government break down these barriers and drive some economic growth.
Yeah, so I tend to think that the next government, whoever that may be, if they have a goal of balancing the books, then thinking about redesigning federal transfers should be something that's on the table. Consolidating what has become an increasing number of conditional grants aimed at very specific targeted areas where the federal government wants to expand the type and amount of different social programs in the province. So we could consolidate all of these grants into just a single block grant, the Canada grant, or whatever clever name we want to give it. And as a condition of that, withhold it from provinces that refuse to eliminate these internal trade barriers or refuse to recognize as valid the rules, regulations, standards, and certifications in other jurisdictions in Canada, right? If it's good in one province, it should be good nationally.
Right.
And the Canada grant could be used to not just help balance the budget over time, but inducing provinces to think about the broader national implications of their local decisions.
Yeah. And Trevor, there is a precedent for this. I mean, for people who are saying, whoa, wait a second, this sounds too assertive for us Canadians. The fact is that after the Second World War, as you write in your
Yeah.
article, something very similar to this, in fact, it happened.
That's right. So after the Second World War, the federal government did want to have, well, it wanted full control over income taxes, personal and corporate. Provinces ceded that room to the feds during the war because we're all rowing in the same direction at that point. But after the war, the feds thought, oh, we should keep this space. And they didn't have the constitutional power to keep all income taxes. So they offered grants to provinces that agreed to rent their income tax room to the federal government, and most did. Ontario and Quebec did not at first, but then the federal government made the grant a little larger, and it was too sweet for Ontario to refuse. Quebec still did. And so for a full 10-year period, the federal government withheld completely all of the grant money to Quebec as it wouldn't agree to cede its income tax room. So it was a 10 years, kind of this messy negotiation, if you will. And ultimately, what that ended up with was not the federal government taking over income taxes, but it did lead to a situation where the federal government is, for most provinces, collecting and managing and administering income taxes, which are now much more harmonized across the country, even though we have both provincial and federal income taxes. And so that's an example where the federal government did, for a long time, withheld considerable funds to try and get agreement on the part of provinces. And yeah, I think we'd see a challenge now where not all provinces would agree to move and eliminate internal barriers to trade, and that would require courage on the part of the federal government to withhold those grants, but we have done that before.
Yeah, and as we know, that tax harmonization drove efficiencies for companies and for the
Indeed.
economy as a whole. Well, Trevor Tombe, thank you so much for coming on Trump's trade war, day 19. I fear we're going to be at this for a while. We always appreciate your writing and analysis in the Hub.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this edition of Trump's Trade War, Day 19. We'll keep at it, giving you the analysis of our best writers and thinkers here at the Hub. You can check out Trevor's latest article for us right now at www.thehub.ca. Back to you soon. Bye-bye.